All right. Well, thank you again for joining part two of our career reboot series. A quick recap of our series for those of us who weren't able to attend our previous event. In June, we were joined by Akiko Bramar, who covered resume tips and tricks. We also broke out into one-on-one sessions to get live resume review feedback. And then part two of our series tonight is focused on the next step of the job search process, which is nailing the behavioral interview. And part two of this series is going to be led by me. As Melissa mentioned, I'm Emily Ritter. I'm one of the directors of Women Who Code Dallas-Fort Worth. And I'm helping organize our Career Reboot series. And when it came time to discussing behavioral or cultural interviews, I realized I had a lot of thoughts to share here. So a little bit of background. I'm coming up on 7 years as an engineer, currently a senior engineer at a company called Palmetto. And prior to my current position, I worked as an engineer in the advertising industry for 5 years. So during my time as an engineer, and before then in my previous career actually too, I had the opportunity to interview for various sized companies. In that I also have experience on the other side of these interviews. I've been active in the interviewing and hiring process during my last several positions. So all of that to say, I've witnessed my fair share here. I've nailed some interviews, unfortunately bombed others, watched candidates wow my team, and sat uncomfortably while others have struggled. But in all these experiences, I've learned, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share my learnings, experience, and tips with you all here tonight. So let's get started. Quick agenda recap, again, some of what Melissa just mentioned. But we're going to start off with a review of what behavioral interviews are in general. We'll talk about what these interviews are, when to expect this interview, how they fit within the hiring process, and why they're important. Then we'll move into how to prepare for these interviews. We'll cover things to do ahead of time, like how to set expectations, how to study and gather resources, how to manage interview stress, and steps to help you prepare even when you aren't actively interviewing. We'll then talk about what to do within the interview itself, and then we'll break out into peer-to-peer breakout rooms to answer some common prompts. So throughout this session, please let me know if you have any questions. I'm more than happy if you want to come off mute, jump in, or if you have questions, you can throw them in the chat, and Joanna and Patti will help flag them for me. Additionally, if you have an example that you'd like to share, please do. I'm a firm believer that we all learn by sharing our experiences. So feel free to jump in. All right, so starting from the top, what is this thing? What are we talking about here? So there are many different names for this type of interview. In our event title, we called it a behavioral interview, but you may also hear some other terms. For example, a culture interview, or a fit interview, or a culture fit interview, although I've seen this term become a little less common as companies move away from the idea of culture fit and instead replace it with the idea of culture add. But another name for these types of interviews may also be just a generic non-technical interview, or it may have some company-specific terminology. But the thing to be aware of is that even when you're applying for technical roles, at some point in the process, you'll likely be assessed for other attributes. In these interviewers, the interviewer is trying to assess things like how you'd fit into the team, how you like to work, how you like to be managed, if your values are in alignment with the company's values. And another thing to be aware of is when these interviews happen. And truth be told, there's a lot of variety. It can show up anytime during the interview process. For example, may hit some behavioral questions in your screening interview with a recruiter, or it may be the first time you meet with your potential manager. Other companies save the culture interview for last. It could also be with people from your prospective team, or maybe it's a representative panel from other people in different departments across the company, really trying to gauge that culture fit. There's a lot of variety in terms of who it can be with, when it can be. And then also know that these types of questions may not even happen in their own separate interview. So really, you should be prepared to answer culture fit interviews at any point during the interview process. So we're going to talk about some of what those questions are and how to feel prepared. Oh, let me get my chat up, make sure I'm not missing anything. What's hidden? Okay. So we talked about what it is. Why should we care about these interviews? Some of that why should probably be apparent, but more specifically, I want to cover a variety of reasons. And the first of which is really important is that technical skills can be taught. Someone may have all the technical know-how, skills, prowess, etc., to do a job, but they also need to be able to work with the rest of the team. Even if you're the brightest engineer on the planet, you aren't going to be working in a vacuum. So these interviews offer insight for the employer to understand what it's going to be like for you working with the team. And this can also be a really great thing for early engineers. Maybe your technical skill set is still developing, but these are interviews where you can demonstrate to the interviewer, and some of the things that they're looking for is the candidate's ability to adapt, grow, collaborate, prioritize, lead, and really strengthen the company culture. So it's important to show up, be prepared, and really add to your technical skill set by nailing the behavioral interview. So that first reason is pretty important in and of itself, that technical skills can be taught. So let's show all of our other skills. But another reason that these interviews are incredibly valuable to you in your assessment of the position is that behavioral interviews are a two-way street of getting to know one another. You'll hear me say this over and over again, two-way street conversation, but I really do feel like it's important to approach these interviews like a conversation and an opportunity to learn if this is the right company and position for you. So at this point in the interview process, you hopefully have a fair idea of what the company does and the needs of the position that you're applying for. And then this is your opportunity to test some of those learnings and assumptions. Lastly, in the why should you care bucket, these interviews are a time to stand out. At this point in the process, the recruiter may have okayed your resume, passed that resume over to the hiring manager to review. And now this is your chance to jump off that sheet of paper, start to tell your story, add some color, add some life. You can show how you've grown in the past and demonstrate the wonderful swath of unique experiences that you bring to the table, all the things that are hard to capture on a resume. So let's talk about some tips for how we can do that. So there are several things that you can and should be doing leading up to an interview, some of which you can start on now, even if you don't have an interview lined up. But let's start with assuming you do have an interview on the horizon. One of the first things you can do is get intel from the recruiter. Some of what you're looking for here is more information about the interview format. It's important to know whether or not you're stepping into a technical interview or a behavioral interview. And it's also important to know who you're interviewing with. For example, is it going to be with your manager or potential teammates? Is it with someone else within the organization? If they can provide some information about who you're interviewing with, you can then use that information to research those individuals and tailor your preparation specifically based on that information. And I know some people are hesitant to reach out to the recruiters, but I think it's important to remember that the recruiter is often on your side, especially at this point in the interviewing process. The recruiter has some vested interest in seeing you do well. A little bit of a tangent, but something I wanted to touch on in terms of dealing with recruiters is that hopefully you're dealing with an awesome recruiter that's helpful and knowledgeable, but you'll likely come across a situation sometime in your career where the recruiter might not know everything. I think it's important to understand that a recruiter is probably working with a bunch of different teams within the organization. All of those teams work differently, have different interviewing processes. So they'll try to provide the best information they can. But if the interview or if the recruiter falls short, just know that your interactions with the people that you're going to be working with are what you should be weighing most heavily. Don't let a bad recruiter or a bad experience with a recruiter get in the way of you finding a position that you really like or a team that you really would enjoy working on. So the next tip in how to prepare is to research the company. And what I mean by that is not just understanding what the company does, but really digging in, scouring the company's website, looking for information about their core values and their leadership team. And then moving from their website and looking on the web for publications from the company, PR mentions, blog posts. Try to get an idea of how the company wants to show up, how they like to show up, what their tone is. Again, harping back on this, you're trying to get a gauge of what the culture is like ahead of time as you prepare, and then you can use the interview to test and challenge those assumptions. Next item on how to prepare, and this is a big one, is to develop what I like to call an interview prep cheat sheet. And some of the things I like to include on this cheat sheet are first and foremost questions you've been asked or questions you're likely to be asked. A great way to start developing this cheat sheet is immediately after an interview, while you're reflecting, jot down the questions that you were asked. Chances are you'll hear some of those same questions over and over again. Another way to build that list is just Google common interview questions. There's a lot of information out there. Use your interview experience to gauge which ones you've come across, which are more common, but there's a lot of resources available. And you can use this list ahead of time before an interview to prep some little mental cues about the information you'd like to incorporate in your responses to those questions, or what you would have done differently reflecting on a recent interview experience. And then in thinking about items to incorporate in your responses, it's also helpful to have a running list of examples to pull from. So we're going to kickstart this list here in a minute, but I'd also recommend adding to it as events happen. So what I mean by that is documenting your wins at work. Maybe you wrap up a project, you get some valuable feedback, maybe you have a really great team retro. When those conversations are happening, if you can develop a habit of adding them to your interview cheat sheet, it'll provide a wonderful wealth of resources for you to pull from as you're preparing. Some other great places to look for examples are, while you're building this cheat sheet, are reviewing your recent performance reviews. What were some of the themes that stood out? What areas did you grow in? And if you're not good at developing this list over time as they happen, by putting them all in one place, putting them in this cheat sheet, it'll start to develop over time as you prepare for these interviews. So maybe you're not touching your cheat sheet every week, but as you go through interview cycles, you're developing it over time. The last bunch of items I like to include on this cheat sheet are questions for the interviewer. I have a list of questions that I like to ask that I'll share here in a minute. But I think it's helpful to be able to develop this list. That way you can use it ahead of time. Again, understanding who you're going to be interviewing with based on that intel from the recruiter, and showing up prepared. One of the great things with this cheat sheet is a lot of positions are remote. A lot of interviews are happening remotely. You can keep that cheat sheet right next to you. No one says you can't. Maybe you don't have it in its full form. Maybe you have some abbreviated version of it where it has little, maybe 2 to 3 word cues that you can know which story or example it's describing, but it can be right there if that helps you more comfortable. In person, that's a little bit trickier, but in-person interviews, I'm still taking notes while the interviewer is talking. Having your notes there with some little cues for you, it is not out of the realm of possibilities. Lastly, and how to prepare, hopefully setting expectations, researching the company, having your cheat sheet helps calm some of those nerves. But I have some other tips as well. And one of the reasons I feel like it's really important to calm your nerves is that you're going to perform better if you're relaxed. But yes, easier said than done. So some techniques I've heard from people are, maybe you have to tell yourself that you don't want or need the job, just to kind of take some of that pressure off. If that is an effective strategy for you, use it. Quick note there, just don't show up apathetic in the interview itself. But if it can help take the edge off, that's great. Another approach I've learned that's slightly less extreme in my mind is to really just view the interview as an opportunity to learn from smart people. When you approach it like a conversation, when you approach it like an opportunity, it can be a little bit less daunting. And if none of those tips help and you've got the pre-interview jitters, I like to incorporate a tip I learned in my intro to public speaking class a long time ago. And that's to reframe that anxiety as excitement, because physiologically, it's a lot of the same response happening in your body. So if you can tell your brain that you're excited for the interview versus anxious about the interview, that may be an effective strategy as well. Oh, I see some good stuff happening in the chat. Final countdown before an interview. Great tip. I got to update my slides. Some jock jams. Beautiful. All right. So as I mentioned, here are some of the questions that I like to ask. These would be on my interview cheat sheet. I know there's a bunch on here, but kind of trying to cover some variety. On the left-hand side, I'll start. What does a typical day look like for someone in this position? A great question for your managers. What are some of the biggest challenges facing the team? How are resources shared among teams? Some of the insight you could get from that is whether or not you're going to just be working within the confines of your team, or if you might be hopping around to other teams. If that's something you enjoy doing or maybe don't enjoy doing, that information could be valuable for you. Some other ones, how are priorities set? What does the product backlog look like and who owns it? That provides some information on what's coming down the pipe, what ownership looks like at the company. Which teams do you work most closely with? Again, getting an idea of interaction between teams. I work as a UI engineer. I work closely with UX and UI designers. Other places there may be a department that is so far away, which makes your job challenging. So understanding the teams that they work closely with is important. Another great question for a manager is how big the team is and what growth looks like over the next year. Then on the right-hand side, I have some questions that are trying to get a little bit deeper into the culture. So one thing I love to ask interviewers is, why do you like working at this company? And how do you feel about your work-life balance? There's a lot of good insight there. A great one for managers, again, is what are the common characteristics of your top performers? Trying to get at what they value. Another one is, how does the company encourage professional development? So that could be a great question for your manager, your potential teammates, maybe a skip level. I think it's a great company or a great question to know answers from throughout the company, because maybe on the ground level, their answer is different from someone higher up in the organization. And the last one was one that I heard recently, which I love for a manager, is tell me about a time when someone on your team was promoted. Again, getting at that culture. What values do they live by? What could your path look like there? FYI, skip level is one level of your direct manager. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I get a little bit jargony at times. So when you're in the industry for so long, it's hard not to. All right. So does anyone else have common questions they like to ask? If you have some great ones, I'd love for you to throw them in the chat or come off mute. Or maybe if you think of them, add them. And I can share my slides as well. Okay. So we've talked about what these interviews are and how to prepare ahead of time. So now let's focus on the interview itself. So one of the things I'm focused on right from the start of an interview is building rapport. I think this is really important because so much of our jobs are focused on communication. And it's important to demonstrate those communication skills in an interview, and building and demonstrating rapport is a helpful technique for communicating effectively. So some ways that you can build rapport are, you can start by mirroring the interviewer's language and their body language, so both verbal and body language. Maybe they use certain phrases in the questions that they're asking, and then you can incorporate that same phrasing back in your response. You can also build rapport by matching tone. So if they're big and loud and use their hands to gesture, you can rise to meet that enthusiasm and again, build rapport that way. Again, remembering that this interview is a conversation, so be conversational. And another way you can be conversational is by asking questions. Here I go again, but this idea of a two-way street. Yes, you want the job. Yes, you want to show up well, but you also want a job that you're going to like. So again, pull from that list of questions. Some interviewers may say that they'll hold some time at the end for you to ask questions, but if you can include them throughout, that's great. Or maybe you have the opportunity to ask some smaller questions throughout the interview. Say, for example, the interviewer asks you about your testing strategy on a project. You answer that and then inquire about what their team's testing strategy was. Or maybe they asked you a question about your values. You answer and then ask about the company's values in return. So let's say the interviewer asks you a question and your head is racing and you don't know how to answer. It's okay to pause and think. And it's okay to say, hey, that's a really great question. I need 10 seconds to think about it, or I need 20 seconds. I need a moment to think about it, because it's so much better to take some time to prep than to just immediately start to ramble and wind up in an endless and confusing monologue that may or may not be going somewhere. So in that situation, pause to think back to your prep work and pull from it if you can. A lot of these questions too, and part of the reason they're so challenging is that they're open-ended. But in responding to them, you want to be specific yet succinct. So again, we're demonstrating our communication skills here. And we'll talk about 2 specific techniques for how to be specific and succinct in a minute. But more generally speaking, when asked an open-ended question, you want to shoot that sweet spot is for about 1.5 to a 2-minute response. And then when you're responding, think about the skills that you want to demonstrate in your answer. What are your strengths and how can you highlight them in your responses? Again, this is your time to jump off that sheet of paper, to be more than a resume and tell your story. So how can you demonstrate your ability to adapt and grow, knowing that that's some of what the interviewer is looking for? Lastly, an important tip, in my opinion, is to demonstrate curiosity. You may not know the answer to every question. And this is especially true for technical interviews, but I feel like it's still relevant here. In my opinion, it's more important to want to know, to want to learn more, than to have everything in your back pocket. So if you can demonstrate that curiosity, show you're curious about the company, about the team, how they work, what their challenges are, I feel like that really helps you level up and show up well in these interviews. All right, so getting back to the 2 techniques that I talked about, you may have heard about these before, but they're great techniques for answering the tell me about a time when questions, and they're the STAR or the PAR techniques. STAR is 4 steps, PAR is 3 steps. I don't get overly committed to the details of either of them, but I think it's a really great framework for training how to respond to these questions. So again, STAR and PAR are pretty similar, but we'll start with the STAR technique first. So again, STAR and PAR are both acronyms. STAR is situation, task, action, and result. PAR, you're subbing the ST for P for problem. But with STAR, you start with the situation. This is where you set the scene and fill in the details of the specific event, kind of just enough information for the rest of the story to make sense. Then you move on into the task, where you explain your responsibilities within that situation that you previously described. Next, you get into the meat of the response, which is the action. Here's where you'll want to describe how you accomplish that task, before lastly wrapping up with the results and describing the impact of your actions. And a pro tip here, if you have quantitative data that you can share, that's really great to incorporate in your result. For example, this led to our customer support team members spending 20% less time on each support ticket. So that little quantitative detail is showing that you truly assessed the impact of what you were working on. So again, PAR, similar to STAR, but you state the problem. And we're going to go over an example of both of these. So in prepping for this presentation, I was looking at resources from other groups, and it turns out the Women Who Code London group also recently did a presentation on behavioral interviews. And Joanna shared a really awesome example, so I'm borrowing from her. And the reason I really liked this example was because the situation didn't happen in the professional world. And many people early in their career will need to pull from other experiences to answer these questions, which is totally valid. So that may make sense when we get into the example, but just pay attention that it's not quite a professional world example, but still super valid. So the prompt here was, tell me about a time when you demonstrated leadership. All right, starting with the situation. When I was in high school, there were several students in my math class who were struggling with some of the more difficult, complex concepts. All right, so brief, to the point, set the scene. Task. With an upcoming national exam, I was tasked by my math teacher to start an after school session to help other students. And then getting into our action, I stayed after school 2 times weekly to review materials. I created a comprehensive study guide. I demonstrated the best methods for solving problems, explained strategies that worked for me, and developed new problems to help them practice. super specific. Those are 5 actions, but very, very concise. And it's really answering that question about leadership. It's demonstrating several qualities of leadership, for example, ownership and coaching, among others. And then for the results, our class average for the national exam was the highest it had been in over 10 years. And overall, the students I helped were able to develop a better understanding and appreciation for math. So again, specific results. Maybe I'm fangirling over this example too much, but I just thought it was great, especially for early career people. All right, so a PAR example. Again, problem, action, result. The prompt here was describe a time when you saw a problem and took the initiative to correct it. All right, so our problem statement. We were nearing the launch of a major client-facing feature that was important to our internal leadership team, and I recognized that pieces of the feature were untested. Again, kind of setting the stage here. Action. I took initiative to develop a test plan, assigned components to teammates, and worked with stakeholders to triage bugs. And results. We deployed the feature on time and without defects, in addition to creating a workflow to follow for future releases. So this example is pretty brief, but maybe if the interviewer wants more specific details, you can then share them in follow-up questions or follow-up responses. And then thinking of this as maybe an example you have on your cheat sheet, once you know the audience of your particular interview, you can tailor it. So for example, if you know you're going to be talking to your manager or a technical teammate, you may want to include some high-level information about the specific feature if it includes a skill set you're interested in demonstrating. Maybe it's using the same framework that you know that the company is using. Or alternatively, maybe your interview is with a product or a project or product manager. You may want to include some information about how you worked with stakeholders, or add more detail about how you triaged bugs, how you created JIRA tickets. So again, one little basic example, but you can adapt it based on your audience. All right, so I put together some other example prompts and questions. The first of which is the tell me about yourself, which you're probably not going to make it through an interview without answering this one. So we're going to spend some time crafting responses to this particular one in our breakout rooms. And I like to think of this tell me about yourself as your elevator pitch, really your time to shine. And then there are some common follow-ups to this, like why are you interested in working for this company? Why you're interested in this position? So those are great things to keep in mind and to mentally prepare for walking into a behavioral interview. And then the rest of the examples I have here are some common tell me about a time wins. So if you have some questions, maybe some tricky ones you've been asked in an interview before, if you want to share those in the chat, we can work on building this list together. But some of these can be really tricky. And we're going to go through some tricky ones here in a minute. Like the tell me about a time when you had a disagreement with a coworker or a manager. Really curious to hear some responses there. All right, so that wraps up the meat of the presentation. I do want to include some of this brainstorming time in our recording because I think it's helpful again in building that cheat sheet. But if you got a pen and paper handy, or maybe your notes up on your computer, we'll start by jotting down some examples of the following. The first of which is try to think of some examples when you were dealing with several technically challenging projects. Maybe focus on like skills you learned there. Maybe you needed to take a Udemy course or do some upskilling outside of work. Think of some technically challenging projects. All right, we can flip back to this, but the next one on the jotting down ideas is try to think of some examples of projects or initiatives that you're proud of. What are some of your achievements professionally or personally, but in a way that you can shape that, mold that story for an interview? All right, next one. Jot down some themes you hear in manager or peer feedback, both positive and negative. So we can swing those negative feedback. I like to think of negative feedback as opportunity for growth. And again, your interviewer is trying to understand how you're able to adapt and grow. Patti, I see you working diligently over there. All right, next one. Coworkers or teams you've struggled to work with. Maybe get your venting out now so you're not doing it within the interview. But what were some of these challenging situations that you've dealt with? Yes, negative feedback, opportunity for growth. I used to kind of shy away from feedback, didn't know how to respond to it, but now I really view it as the gift that it is, and eliminating blind spots. All right, one more bullet point here is projects that did not go well or that hit a bunch of bumps along the way. So maybe these are projects that had shifting priorities, or classic, we've probably been in this before, projects with too many stakeholders. Okay. Again, I'm going to keep this recording before we break out into our rooms, but the first question that we're going to be answering in our breakout rooms is the tell me about yourself. So again, our sweet spot here is shooting for a 1.5 to 2 minute response. Moving away from our breakout rooms just for a second, I also kind of like to plan a 1 or 2 liner, as well as a longer form story about for my tell me about yourself, just based on the audience or the vibe I'm getting in the interview. But some things to keep in mind for your tell me about yourself is keep it professional, but be personal. This isn't your time to talk about your favorite color, but it's okay to show some personality here. For example, including things like, I was interested in learning more about X, so I shifted into a role where I was able to do that. Like, show your motivations. I think those are some really powerful statements that you can include in your tell me about yourself. Additionally, we got 1.5 to 2 minutes, but try to demonstrate your area of expertise. What frameworks are you familiar with? What skills, technical skills, what expertise are you bringing to the table? This is also an opportunity to connect the dots between your resume. So maybe you have multiple roles within a single organization. What you can include here is, I started as a junior engineer and was promoted into X position after Y amount of time. Or maybe you have some positions that are fairly similar. Like, I worked for 2 different advertising agencies. I tend to include that in my tell me about yourself as, I have 5 years of advertising experience. So kind of summarizing a bit of my resume. And then lastly, a way to really make these answers powerful is to end with what you're looking for and the value you can provide. So kind of talk about where you've been, but end with where you're going. Okay, so with that, I'm going to pause, see if we have any questions, and then we're going to break out into our breakout rooms to answer again the tell me about yourself. All right, let's see. Go back to the previous slide for a quick sec. Yeah. Seasonal interview and practice session. Yeah, I think, I don't know if I'm answering your question exactly, Katie, but if anyone is interested in getting more experience interviewing, we have our career advice channel in Slack. It's a really great way to get feedback. I know that some people previously have asked for mock interviews. It's a great place to network and do some of that. Okay, I'm happy to take you up on that one. Okay. Well, then with that, I'm going to stop the recording. Or Melissa, if you can do that.